Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Cheeky Scholar. This is the podcast where smart and cheeky scholars share their knowledge about history, art, and culture and bust a whole lot of myths along the way. I'm your host, Dr. Lara Ayad. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. For this episode, I had a chance to sit down with Tamar Avishai. Tamar is the creator and host of the Lonely Palette podcast. Now, if you've listened to the Lonely Palette before, you know that Tamar goes around the Boston Museum of Fine Arts with a microphone and she interviews unsuspecting passersby, asking them what they think of the artworks that are on display, what the artworks look like, and how it affects them emotionally. Tamar also goes deep into the history of the artworks that are on display, providing cultural context. She ultimately brings art history to the masses. If you haven't checked out the show, I highly recommend you go ahead and search for it in your podcast feed. So I was really excited to sit down with Tamar and talk about art, and in particular, to talk about what the role of the artist is in society today, and what the role of art museums should be. For instance, we talked about questions like, should museums exhibit art that some people consider offensive? And is censorship always the answer to art that could be considered offensive or having offensive imagery? And when does censorship go too far? Coming out of the conversation, I kept thinking about what Tamar said about artists, because she argues that artists are journalists with emotions. She also says that museums should steward art as a reflection of society, both the good and the bad parts. So stay tuned for this one. I think you're going to really like it. So Tamar, welcome to The Cheeky Scholar. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm not bad. I'm 8 months pregnant, so I'm a little achy, but otherwise the flesh is weak, but the spirit is willing.
That's such a good way of putting it. Well, congratulations again on your expecting.
You.
That's incredible. Yeah. Yeah. And I know you're growing the family too, right? So this is not your first rodeo.
No, this is my third and final.
Goodness. Oh,
Ladder's
my goodness.
Being pulled up.
Yeah.
After this.
Yeah. Well, that's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I understand. So first of all, I just want to say, Tamar, I want to give a shout out because when I was first thinking about doing this podcast, you were one of the first people I turned to ask for advice on how to create one and everything. And you gave me such good advice, including, you told me a lot of people think that they should make a podcast based on what they want to say, but you told me make a podcast based on what you'd want to hear as a podcast listener. And that was one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten. So thank you for
I'm
that.
So
That's
glad.
it's been really inspirational, and it's actually given me concrete direction and where to take this project. So yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That was a hard won lesson myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually something that so many podcasters, it's like no judgment. I mean, why make a podcast if you don't feel like you have something to say? But if you want people to listen, you gotta know too what they want to hear. And I think that's striking that balance, because you don't want to be totally captured by your audience, and you don't want to make something that, like you censor yourself, or you kind of take on a persona that isn't you in order to increase your audience. I mean, that's no good either. You have to find that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sure that as things go along, I'll even find a way to kind of carve my place even more while also speaking to an audience. So yeah, that's great advice. So
hopefully will we all.
Yes, hopefully, crossing our fingers. So Tamar, what is really cool about this conversation is we both have backgrounds in art history, right? And I know you are the host of the Lonely Palette podcast. I love the name of that podcast. And I know that you have kind of gotten back into launching some new episodes. So maybe first tell us like what you have, kind of on the docket for what's coming up and what audiences can expect.
Well, I've been away for a while. And so I feel like I'm kind of simultaneously kind of to the brim with what I would love to put out there and really dive into, and episode ideas that I've had for years and years, and I've been kind of gathering tape, just kind of here and there to someday make the episode. And also feeling really rusty, like really out of practice. I've spent the last year, almost and a half, like year and a bit, away from the Lonely Palette because I've just been really trying to build up my own freelance audio business and portfolio.
Okay.
I've been making a lot of audio for other people, and it's been incredibly educational. And I can already feel my show kind of bending and evolving and growing based on having worked with so many other audio producers and also kind of being the audio producer who helps shape someone else's voice. But now I'm kind of taking that back to my roots and trying to figure out, how best to make, how much better I can make my show, and how much better of a producer I can be in that show. But I'm also like somewhere in there, I'm also an art historian. And I find myself, okay, so it's 2025. I officially graduated from college 20 years ago. That's a long time to be away from the field. I got a master's after that, so I guess I can only start the clock at 2008 when I finished my master's. But the last time I really, kind of did the university breadth over depth thing, I think art historians had really different priorities and really different concerns. And, my department at the University of Toronto, where I did my undergrad, had really different professors, and professors who studied very specific things that now have been quite diversified. That it wasn't when I was there. So I'm starting to recognize that, I don't know, there's like a little bit of old fart in there in my education. And I'm tempted
to say puts the art in old fart, but that's so terrible and cheesy, but there you go.
I like it. I like it. The Lonely Palette, it puts the art in old fart. But that's, when I talk to undergrad classes now, I realize I've been away a long time. And the industry has changed a lot. Like the field, the discipline has changed a lot. And the way that art history is taught has changed a lot. And, maybe I kind of represent a small piece of that, which is cool. But, so, like in the birdcage, it's like, so all of that has just come out through my eyes.
Wow. That is so interesting, Tamar, because the way I see your show, The Lonely Palette, is, even though I know you don't necessarily identify traditionally as a scholar, in the more kind of traditional sense, I identify
as a cheeky scholar.
As a cheeky oh my God, I love that. I love that. I was like so proud to have you as like one of the guests on the show. Absolutely a cheeky scholar. So that's the thing, is like your show, The Lonely Palette, is bringing art history to the masses. I know that's like one thing you have really felt very passionate about. And, having this kind of, I guess you could almost like a digital humanities project of bringing this art historical analysis to a more public platform on a podcast. You don't need to be going to college. You don't need to pay for expensive college classes to learn in depth about one artwork or another as you're listening to the podcast.
Or be in the museum, for that matter.
Or to be in the museum. And I know when you had started the podcast, you were going around mostly the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and really focusing on one artwork there on display and starting off each episode, just asking passersby and people visiting, what do you think of the work? What does it look like? Describe it. What kind of impact does it have on you? And it's such a provocative and also very thoughtful way to engage with art, that you are not looking at the artwork by listening to the episode, but you are listening to people's experiences of the artwork and the way they visually describe. So you have to imagine what that looks like. And there's something about that okay, yeah, you need the formal analysis of looking at the visual qualities of an artwork, but there's also this deeply imaginative and also kind of a cultural collective aspect to art history that comes through, I think, in The Lonely Palette.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really, no, I love thinking about it that way. You know, I still see the object in person, you know, 95% of the time, and you know, record people's first responses to it. And, you know, I say this all the time, but like, you don't hear all the people who say, no, I don't want to be recorded, because they are so worried that they're going to be on the hook to say something really profound, when that's exactly, you know, I can't say it enough. Like, it doesn't have to, you don't have to know anything about this artwork. Please, any interpretation is actually, like, it hurts. It doesn't help. Like, just describe what you see. And still people are very uncomfortable talking about art in that kind of environment. And so that always reinforces to me why a show, you know, I'm not going to say why my show needs to exist, but like why an approach to art history that I find so compelling needs to exist too, in order to get people to understand how very human these artworks are, and that anybody telling them that it's not for them to understand without a PhD, they're the failures. You know, like, they're the ones who are kind of misinterpreting the work. And I speak for all of us art historians there. Like, if that's the story that people are getting, it's the incorrect one.
Yeah. So this is so interesting, Tamar, because it's when I think about science museums, for instance, you know, they often tend to, if you notice, science museums tend to, in contrast to art museums, science museums tend to attract families with kids and people going there. You don't have to be a scientist to go to a science museum. Everybody knows that. You're going there to learn about things you don't know. Why do you think that art museums seem to have a very different place in our society, that we're not a lot of people are not necessarily going to art museums to learn in that same way? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah. No, that reminds me of I was talking to an art critic who was saying that the only other place besides art museums in kind of cultural spaces where people are expected to kind of know the story going in is the sports page of the newspaper, and how it's like, we don't, you know, people who are into sports don't realize that somebody who is not following sports at all, like it's varsity level. Like, you pick up the sports page and it's like, well, I don't know the context of all of this. You know, it's like, this is not for me if you don't already follow it. And I always thought that was a really great comparison. I mean, look, science museums, I would imagine, if you would compare the missions or the mission statement of any science museum as compared to an art museum, they're going to have some really fundamentally different mandates. That a science museum will always put education first, because that's what that space is for. They're not actually, you know, conducting like high level scientific experiments. They're breaking it down and turning everything into play. And that's the purpose of a space like that. The mission of most art museums is to be stewards of these objects. It's to collect, preserve, you know, like, and educate. But that's always, it's like usually the last one. And it's only really recently that education even was part of the mission of art museums. Up until that point, it was about stewardship and preserving these objects from generation to generation. So for people to kind of come in and expect, like, you know, it's not like they're going to touch them or handle the artworks, or, you know, it's like, oh, that's what a Monet feels like. I mean, you know, that whatever you can learn from that, which actually wouldn't be nothing. I think that, you could learn a lot from kind of like feeling the texture of the paint. Can you imagine? How
Totally.
cool that would be?
You'd be amazed, Tamar.
But
I remember one time, I'm trying to remember where I was. I might have been at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. This was years ago, back when I was like barely even in grad school. And I saw they had some ancient Egyptian artworks, including like a sculpture of I think it was a portrait of a pharaoh, but a pharaoh as like a sort of sphinx figure. And it was like, I don't know, about small to medium size. And one guy just like was walking by it and he just like kind of like touched it and like scratched the base and then just like kept walking. And I was like, and
rubbed
what I
its
thought,
nose for good luck.
rubbed its nose for, yeah. It's like, that's why those statues always have like shiny noses and shiny boobs for some reason. Is because people are always rubbing the wrong parts of or the right parts of the sculpture. But it's all just to say, it's so interesting how our reaction to that too is, oh no, you're ruining the artwork. Like there is this sort of presumption of like stewarding, being stewards of these objects.
Like, again, you go into a science museum, those musical stairs or those little like balls that like all light up with the electricity from your hand and make your hair, those aren't thousands of years old. Those aren't 500 years old. Those are made for the experience of play and education. And so, in that way, I understand why art museums are just fundamentally different spaces, like just because they're all museums doesn't mean that they are doing the same thing. And so, that said, it goes a little far when art historians take the connoisseurship piece of their jobs, when they prioritize it over the education piece. And I think that people have just kind of accepted that. Like visitors kind of feel like, well, if I'm not the expert here, it's not for me to, I how many people have you talked to? It's like, well, I don't know if it's good. I don't know art. Like I like it, but I don't, it's not for me to say. And, I am not a curator. I'm not a connoisseur. I am an educator. So those are the people I want to talk to. And there are curators doing their jobs and conservators doing their jobs and preparators doing their jobs and me, and all the people like me who are really interested in kind of being the conduit between the incredibly human story of the people who made this work and the complicated times that they lived in, and people who happen to be on the planet now experiencing these objects who are also living through a really complicated time, and finding that point of connection between the two and giving people permission to relate to them.
Yeah. What's a good example of that comes to mind for you? Maybe an artwork, say, that you think is, wow, this is such a human creation, and this is something that nowadays we in our complicated times could learn something from or connect to in some way.
I mean, maybe this is front of mind for me just because of my my delicate condition. But I love walking into a Louise Bourgeois gallery and seeing people be absolutely repulsed and sharing a certain amount of that repulsion, but they don't know why. It's like they feel like, and she's not looking outside of her, she's not like Katie Kollwitz, I mean, she's not kind of basing her work on the context of war. And Louise Bourgeois is interested in her own body. She's interested in bodies. And she has some really extraordinary pregnant bodies that my favorite is one, I forgot what the actual name is. It's something goddess, but it's like meant to be kind of subversive and cheeky. And the one that she does when she's younger, and has a lot of anxiety around pregnancy, is like made of brass or something very, very hard and unappealing. I mean, it's
Mm.
beautiful, it's smooth, but it's like it's very intentionally not soft. And then she revisited it when she was in her like 80s, and she made the same sculpture but in like pink felt.
Mm.
And I love that evolution of hers because it's like the same evolution that you know, anybody goes through themselves when they have kids. Like that it goes from this incredible place of anxiety to, if I had only known that I didn't have to be so scared. Like that which you can't know. You do it, you only do it for the first time once, thank God. And then any subsequent time, it never has to be for the first time again.
Mm.
But it's like you can see her own evolution there. And suddenly it makes her work, which again is like it can be really revolting. I feel like that softens it, humanizes it, makes it incredibly accessible if you were to see those two sculptures side by side and and apply it, kind of project your own life and experience onto that if that's something you've experienced.
That's really interesting too. And just for some background for the listeners, Louise Bourgeois was pretty active in the 80s. I believe she's an American artist, got really active in the 80s, and she still is active as an artist. She went back to this artwork, it sounds like, in the 80s. And so, yeah, she's coming from a very different context than, say, someone like Kathy Kollowitz that you brought up before. But it is kind of incredible how artwork, without using text, without using words, but actually through the use of things like texture and color and things like that, can evoke such strong reactions based,
Mm-hmm.
depending on like where you are in life and what you're bringing to the table. So it's not just about the artist with a capital A, bringing meaning to the passive vessel viewer. It's more actually an interesting kind of quiet dialogue, if you will,
Mm.
between the person encountering the artwork and then the artwork itself, and in a way, the artist too, as maybe a third party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really fascinating. So what then, kind of stepping back to and looking at museums and looking at artists. I mean, these are, of course, we're talking about art museums and where they're overlapping, but maybe we can step back too. And I'm curious to ask you, Tamar, what do you think the role of the artist is in today's society? And you mentioned like we live in a complicated world. I know it's a big question, but what do you think should be the role of an artist in today's society?
I think the role of the artist in today's society is the same as the role of the artist has been for the last 200 years, ever since artists were given a kind of intellectual and philosophical and financial autonomy to create what they want, and to respond to the world that they're observing. That's when you start to see the artists who, my grad school advisor, she always loved the idea of I mean, she focused specifically on mid 19th century Paris, but the Saltimbanque, like or the flaneur, or somebody who kind of exists on the outskirts of society and observes, and that the the I feel like artists are journalists with emotions. I feel like they look at the world around them and they create based on how it affects them, and they tell the story of their moment. Um, they can be completely subjective about it. they can be activists, but they have a responsibility to tell that story correctly. And without censoring themselves. And so it's really important that an artist just capture something very, very authentic about the moment that they're living in. Even if that's not the whole story, even if that's their story, but to be really truthful about their own experience that way. And to have some talent in the application of materials too, to not just have a very profound insight, but to be able to express it in a way that will make people look, that requires a very specific kind of gift, artistic gift. But I guess that kind of begs the question, like, what an artist shouldn't do.
Make ugly art that doesn't make you want to look. Well, Louise Bourgeois made that revolting art, and it made you look, right?
It certainly doesn't have to be pretty. If anything, really pretty art, people will buy. And that's a different business model than kind of being the kind of artist who is hailed as the kind of genius who's able to kind of like put their finger on the pulse of the moment and get, like have museums be interested in what they do. But like, look, museums are businesses too. I mean, there's nobody has like super clean hands, and especially not artists, but like there's no arbiter in the moment that says, oh, okay, you're great, you're shit, you've said it brilliantly, you're derivative. You need some time away. You need some distance to kind of look at what is going to last, because it's very hard to kind of know what any society is going to say. Okay, this really was the most important authentic moment to capture. So it's like it duels itself. There's a battle there between the ability to capture the moment as it's being lived and like historians taking a step back and being like, well, was that the most important moment to capture? And I think that that's what art historians and historians really struggle with. I think that that's a really complicated part of the job, is, determining whose authenticity is going to speak loudest, for the moment that it's representing.
Right. And there's even this whole issue too of artists that will maybe try to get their works into galleries and into museums based on what they think, not just curators, but also directors and donors will want to see in a museum. And that can be very complicated and quite frankly, socially and politically charged as well, right? So there's a whole other layer to that as well. And artists have always been, I think you're bringing up the emergence of this new role for an artist 200 years ago is really interesting, because artists for thousands of years have been making art to make ends meet, put bread on the table. I know that in parts of Europe prior to the early modern period, or prior to at least even the early 1800s, there wasn't really a common word for artist the way that we use it today, right? It was usually a craftsperson or a craftsman, and they were making art for a patron who paid to make an artwork that filled a religious or a practical function, right? So this artist, the way we understand it today with like the capital A, the genius that makes an artwork to express themselves or to speak to a higher concept that's not religious, this is kind of new, right? And I think it's interesting to see how, yes, there's an economic factor still, even after thousands of years, but that the playground is kind of shifted, right? Yeah. Is there any artist that you can think of, Tamar, that you think really is a really good example of an artist that perhaps pushes boundaries, really authentically expresses themselves, and fills that role in the way you were talking about just earlier?
Um, I don't have the same experience with living artists as I do with dead artists because I am a modernist, with a capital M. So, kind of 18, like, so like 1950 is my cutoff. Um, but two artists who I feel like have I kind of wonder if it's cheating to say somebody like Anselm Kiefer, who is probably one of the most famous and richest living artists today. So, he has an experience that is not, that's like saying like Beyonce. There are a lot of other musicians out there who are struggling and are talented and maybe even more talented, but it's like, um, but I feel like Kiefer, because I personally have put so much of my own kind of scholarly energy into post-Holocaust representation, like I find that his work as a German born in 1945, constantly trying to grapple, maybe not as much anymore, but it certainly was a huge part of his career for kind of the formative part of his career. He was really, really trying to understand what it meant to grow up in a society filled with shame and atonement and be born into that and take something like the Nazi salute, kind of be born into something where just this way that you can put your hand can get you arrested. And you're a kid and you kind of, like we don't we don't tend to give a whole lot of kind of our own mental real estate to the afterlives and the after generations of the perpetrators because that's like not where the narrative makes us feel good, and so we move away from that. But he did this series of this of like doing the Nazi salute in front of like a tree, like in front of the ocean, and showing how impotent it was when it's just one person trying to understand its power. And he didn't do it to be like he knew it was outrageous, but that wasn't the point. He wasn't trying to offend. He was trying to understand, kind of looking back at his own hand, like, where is the offense here? Because of course it's there, and of course there's this incredible semiotic power. I mean, God, we are kind of in that moment right now. How, whether or not, the hand gestures we've seen, is meant to do that. Like, he was wrestling with that in a very, I feel, authentic way. And from there, he really dives into the poetry of the Holocaust survivor Paul Celan, and trying layer to understand what it means to articulate tragedy. And so, that, like, I don't know, I kind of fall into his work and I'm just so fascinated by how he, how his brain works, like how he wraps his brain around these ideas, or maybe doesn't even know where he's going when he starts. He just, just layers materials upon materials. And another artist who I think is able to really articulate the moment is Carrie Mae Weems. I find her photography to be so beautifully humane and, you know, like her kitchen table series, it's so beautiful. It's so, like, I remember looking at her work, especially in 2020, and in that moment where it was very, very important to delineate, to kind of draw lines, and to use very specific categorizations to determine who is allowed to tell what story.
Mm.
And I think in some more productive ways, we've moved past that. Like I think people have kind of recognized that there are kind of strategic and tactical limitations to division. Even as we recognize the value of lived experience and not knowing what you don't know in a way that has been very important. And I hope that's what stays in the culture, even as we kind of get past the separateness. But then I would look at her kitchen table series and I would see an artist, and this is just her take, where she was like, look at how much we all have in common. Look at how my family, my Black family sitting around our kitchen table is exactly the same as your white table sitting around your kitchen table. And we have all the same complicated dynamics. And you have mothers and daughters and like she is kind of the sun, or, she and the pendant light in that series is the sun around which everyone else circles. And so you see her with like her husband and them kind of having, kind of mundane interactions and also very loaded interactions. And you see that same with her own children, and you see that with her parents. And it's just like she is a human being living her life. And granted, she's modeling. Like it's not really her. It's not really her life. But I am so moved by the scenes that she stages in that series. And I feel like I really, really connect to what she's trying to say about our shared humanity. And that was very, like, I clung to that like a life raft in 2020.
In a life raft in a tumultuous, raging ocean storm. That it's kind of interesting because although we're really past the pandemic, and yet we are still in these very complicated times. And I am really struck by how we're just barely coming to terms with the idea that actually, okay, yes, identity can be important, positionality can be important, but just like everything else in the world, it can have its limitations. And when you take a certain idea too far, what you can... I had one friend of mine who described a certain, I guess you could say, sociocultural political stances as being like a spectrum. And a spectrum is really like a circle, right? So you've got like the infrared and you've got the ultraviolet. They're at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's a circle. The one leads into the other. And if you start going too far in one direction, it's going to go into the other. And I loved that analogy because... Here we go with an art historical visual analogy. I love that analogy, though, because I think I think it really does capture, in this case, where, this insistence on we are different from you, we have nothing in common with you or with these other people or those people over there. It can create a situation where we are starved for a sense of like, well, what are we fighting for? Like, who can we relate to? You talked about shared humanity, and I really do think that art has a particular power like Carrie Mae Weems's work in helping us understand, oh, we have a lot more in common than we have different. Like the differences are important, yes, but we have a lot more in common, and recognizing the importance of that commonality could be the antidote to so many of the problems that we are facing
Absolutely.
today. Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I am it's interesting. Like I had a bit of a revelation. So my kids are super into Dr. Seuss right now, and
How
as
old are
are
they?
they are 3 and 5.
Mm.
And there are so many terribly written children's books out there. And if you ask me, the worst ones are the ones that try to ape Dr. Seuss but can't. Like, he is a
Yeah.
genius. He is the musicality of his rhymes and his cadences, like, they're just perfect. And it's such a pleasure to read. Not like One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, which is like 50 pages too long. But, the ones that the ones that like are great are genius. And we just got a whole new batch. So we got Yertle the Turtle and Sneetches. And these are unbelievably progressive stories. It's really powerful. I mean, the Butter Battle book is a good one. Like it's kind of like thought to be his political one because it's so clearly about the Cold War.
Mm.
But Sneetches is about and like stop me if like this is obvious. But Sneetches is about, these two, these like animals, I guess, like they're Dr. Seuss creations, but one, they all look the same except half of them have stars on their bellies. And they turn that into this like caste system where if you don't have the star, you're left out. And, that the children with the stars won't play with the children without the stars. And so it's like just understood that the Sneetches without stars, they don't have a star on their bellies, are second-class citizens in their society. And this like huckster comes to town with a machine that puts stars on Sneetch bellies, and they all pay to get the stars on. And then the ones who have the stars are like, well, we can't have this. So he's like, oh, it's okay. I have another machine that takes stars off. And then the one without the stars still kind of like work their way higher up. And they just spend like days and days going in and out of machines until finally nobody knows who was who.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it brings their society together. And then you
Wow.
have like Yertle the Turtle, where Yertle is this like mean turtle king who stacks like 1,000 turtles so that he can see really high. And the one at the bottom who's been kind of like, I don't want to like make a fuss, but like this really hurts. Like finally he's just like over it and he burps and the whole thing just falls down. and and it's like this incredibly like Marxist, wonderful story. And I was thinking, I promise this all has a point. Not just that art can be, even art for kids can be, incredibly powerful. But I was thinking about how I found in my old box of books to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, which during that really crazy time in 2020 when, kind of identity melted people's brains, that book was taken off the shelves
Hmm.
because it came out in the 30s, and there are some drawings of like some caricatured, like a caricature of a Chinese guy like waving chopsticks or something. I mean, like that's kind of considered like that was enough that the estate of Dr. Seuss was pressured to stop publishing that book. And I was really glad to find my own copy of it because you can't really get it anymore. And I thought to myself, what world are we living in where you have the same writer who writes the Lorax and Sneetches and Yertle the Turtle and the Butter Battle book, and who is able to take these incredibly complex ideas about the importance of shared humanity and of diversifying your worldview and making room for everybody because there is space for everybody, and not treating anybody as though they're more valid or higher up than anyone else. And he's fucking canceled because of a drawing that he did in the 30s when, I'm not defending it, but like, come on. That is such a deliberate blind eye to the larger contributions of this man to the world and his art. And that kind of thinking really opened my eyes to what felt like the real kind of flattened incoherence of this activist movement. And that it didn't feel serious.
It didn't feel serious in what sense? Like, is there something maybe about it, Tamar, that you kind of interpreted or experienced as maybe a little inauthentic, or like where?
I think it was looking for easy wins. And
Okay.
nothing that is being tackled in the identity politics game right now is easy. And to take pleasure in the kind of mob cancellation of willful misinterpretation. Like we talked a lot. We all thought a lot about impact versus intention. And I think I would have gone into 2020 thinking that only intention mattered. And in that way, my thinking was really complicated. Like I realized actually impact matters a lot too. But to only focus on impact and not intention is just as facile in the other direction.
Yeah.
And so that to me felt like you're not really taking this seriously. Like this is, like in Succession when he's just like, you're not serious people. Like if you're just looking for what can fit on a picket sign, you're not really taking these incredibly complicated, nuanced problems all that seriously.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you mentioned, those caricatures of Chinese people. I mean, I don't agree with them. They stink, right? But at the same time, like what might be, Dr. Seuss also contributed so many other great things in literature and did such a phenomenal job with just changing the landscape of children's books and children's writing. And he really is an artist, was an artist. What might be a more productive way of approaching, whether or not you choose to publish a book? Like, let's say you continue publishing the books with these caricatures. Would it be possible to say, should we just like kind of like put it out there, not say anything about it? Should we give some context for some things? Because he was writing some of these in the 1930s and it was a different time. What do you think of that? Like how, in other words, I guess my question is, if somebody made art that is kind of offensive, and was intended to stereotype or caricature a whole group of people, how could we look at it today in a way where we're not sterilizing our world of art by taking it out completely? But is there perhaps another way we could approach it?
Look, my son wanted to watch Peter Pan the other day, and so we popped it on, and there was that black screen at the beginning that gave that disclaimer about, what you're about to watch is like deeply racist. It was wrong then and it's wrong now. I mean, my husband and I kind of joke about that. It's like, honestly, because, and I don't want to sound like I'm not taking this seriously. Like, I recognize that language has to be incredibly workshopped, and it reads as though it is. There are people who are going to see stuff that they weren't expecting that is not particularly savory and, like has been deemed offensive or is now being seen for how offensive it really was in our contemporary society. It just happened all at once that it's hard to kind of look at that. We were watching like Muppet Show episodes that also too are, there's a kind of like, we grew up in the like tomboy free to be you and me world.
Yeah.
So we
Like
all
late 80s,
kind of
90s
feel
kind
like,
of, yeah.
yeah, like we all kind of feel like, you know, like content of one's character is what matters anyway. However, again, that doesn't take into account that people move through the world in very different ways from each other, and you wouldn't know that. You don't know what you don't know about the way that other people are experiencing the world, or I kind of hesitate to like bring up like microaggressions, but like it's true, it's real, and things that you don't realize until you talk to people, and it's like, Jesus, I never saw that, and they're like, yeah, no, you wouldn't have. And it's like, oh shit, like that's true, like, okay.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the Muppet Show, it's like, to have a big black screen in front of it that says it was wrong then and it's wrong now. I mean, it was the Muppet Show. It was genius. So, like we take it with a grain of salt. But anyway, he wants to watch Peter Pan. Peter Pan is a really, like, nobody comes out of Peter Pan covered in glory.
That's
there's
true.
some super racist stereotypes in there, and in a way you can kind of appreciate the childlike perspective of kind of categorizing people into groups and almost seeing the worst of them. Like what's scariest about every different group, if you really want to like dig into the psychology of Peter Pan, like that's, you could do that. But if you're a kid and you're watching it and you see, the way that Native Americans are depicted,
All
and
right.
and
Yes.
no
Now I
one
remember
is,
that.
yeah, what makes the red man red? I mean, and no adult is kind of like, it's not really how we talk about people anymore. Like it was wrong then and it's wrong now.
Yeah.
Like that is a valid conversation. And so what I think is so important is that conversation. And you can't have that conversation if things are just removed from Disney Plus quietly, or if a Dr. Seuss book is taken off the shelf. And I feel like that black screen and that workshop language can be a little clumsy and corporate, but it is far preferable to taking the art away. That is the worst thing you can do. And I will say that till my throat is sore. You can't fight bad ideas with censorship. You fight bad speech with good speech, with better speech. And I think that's like, if someone is going to espouse really contemptible opinions, let them be heard for them, so that then the world can look at them and say, that was a really ignorant opinion.
Yeah. So now we know what we're getting.
Yeah, like you are reinforcing to me why I believe, why I have my moral conviction and my moral center, and you are so far to the extreme of it that I don't particularly want to engage with you. Like let people show their asses that way.
Yeah.
I mean, we're kind of drifting away from art, but
Well,
I think that artists have an obligation also to like play around with those extremes also.
yeah.
And like challenge people to expand their thinking.
Is there?
And yeah.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm not exactly sure what point I'm making, but I feel like an artist who is only making what they think is going to land with their audience or confirm their audience's priors or get them booked at a show, where the gallery stands to make a lot of money or, kind of be really accepted, not only is making something that is not going to last or kind of stand the test of time, but they aren't encouraging people to expand their own thinking at all about what the work can be and what, representing something that someone never would have thought of or intentionally destabilizes them, makes them think about something differently or subverts an idea. But it's a risk. Like, as the artist, you have to be willing to be disliked because you're making someone uncomfortable. And I think that kind of goes back to that, like, flaneur, person who's like never trying to integrate into society. They're just trying to observe and be authentic to their moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that there's, I guess my next question then, Tamar, is if an artist wants to make a work that is very provocative and that is not just like, for instance, and I apologize, I'm now forgetting his name. You threw out the artist who's doing like the Nazi salutes as a way to make a point.
Anselm Kiefer.
Anselm Kiefer, yes, thank you. So Anselm Kiefer, you mentioned like he wasn't trying to be offensive. That wasn't the goal of the work, even though that might have been like a kind of side product of his work. Let's say an artist wants to make something that is not just made for the sake of offense, but is made to like make a point, and in the process, you could be upsetting quite a few people, or even just a very small but very vocal smaller group of people, because that does happen. How should a museum approach something like that? Like curator wants to put their artwork on, and then there's this whole issue of like, do we censor? Do we not censor? Yeah. What do you think people should do in a situation like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Kiefer did offend a ton of people. Like he barely came back from that professionally. And so that was like a really interesting lesson for him. But also I wouldn't be surprised if he was like a little edgy and like didn't, kind of like he knew he was doing something that was technically illegal in Germany, and yet, still kind of went for it in that way that artists can be those kinds of guys or ladies. But
I have a hierarchy of artists and like where they are on the kind of D-bag scale.
Yeah, exactly. I would not want to hang out with Anselm Kiefer.
I think there's like painters occupy a certain level, and then the sculptors are somewhere else, and I'm not going to go beyond that because I'll get in huge trouble for saying that. But anyway.
Yeah, and the video installation artists, my God. How do museums deal with it now? Well, is now 10 years ago, is now 5 years ago, is now today.
My goodness.
10 years ago, there was you still had kind of the last gasps of exhibitions that were really, propping up art that could be outrageous, that could be really subversive. I have a catalog that my stepmother, who wrote a lot. I mean, she's a comparative Jewish literature professor, but she also wrote a lot about Holocaust memory too. It was an entire exhibition on Nazi imagery in art, very Kiefer-esque actually, in order to kind of show how kind of corporatized a very specific way of looking at the Holocaust became. What Norman Finkelstein calls the Holocaust industry. So, stuff that was just like, you go through this catalog and it's so offensive. Like canisters of Zyklon B, but but they've got like designer labels on them, like Hermes and Chanel, and like, yeah, exactly. I'm looking at your face right now. Like, it's very unsettling, very upsetting, very disturbing. Like a Lego set of Auschwitz, like stuff like that. Um, you know, 15 years ago, that was a totally valid show. Like no one would have canceled that, even as upsetting as it is, because it was like, whoa, this is some art, man. Like, this is talking to a very specific issue in Holocaust memory, and like, sure, go for it. Like, they invited a lot of these artists to create for it. 5 years ago, that show would never, ever, ever, ever have been mounted. Today, I think that there's a bit of a sea change, a vibe shift, like away from the impulse to censor from 5 years ago, that I kind of wonder if people, if the pendulum might be swinging a little bit back. I still don't think it would be mounted today, but I don't think it would have been as clearly verboten as it would have been like 5 years ago. But museums are constantly trying to figure out how to stay relevant, how to get people in the door, how to please both the donors who give them money and the social media followers who give them like clout, who are very often very opposite sides of the spectrum. I would not want to run a museum today. I feel like I'd be terrified all the time. There are some museums, I think, that have, like, before we talked tonight, I was kind of reading up on the Philip Guston show that was delayed. I think it originated at the National Gallery and then was going to tour around the country. And here was a, white Jewish artist who had a lot of depictions of Klansmen in his work. And for an interestingly kind of, again, everything comes back to Kiefer. No wonder he's so famous and rich. But he also kind of wanted to show like the impotence of something that was so iconic and semiotically charged. He would show Klansmen in very mundane circumstances. And as a way of really kind of like like defanging it, kind of taking the piss out of them, like, taking something that would have been otherwise very hard to look at and exposing it for, again, its own kind of like unseriousness, like it's farce. And that was going to be very much part of the show because that's very much part of his work. And instead, the show was like knee-jerk canceled because they just had, these images had Klansman imagery in it. Never mind what he was trying to say about it. And that was like, that took all the keyboard warriors. Like, that took a lot of artists and, art adjacent people who signed this open letter who was like, come the fuck on. Come on. Like, this just isn't, like, you're so willfully misinterpreting his work. And so it ended up kind of getting revived, and I was able to see it at the MFA in Boston when it was there. And, there was a lot of kind of like scaffolding around the show. There was like signs for, kind of like trauma, like if you need a break, here's a space where you can go, and here are some images like actual Klans rallies, which I don't think were really necessary, but they were like behind like a shutter, and so you would kind of only look at it like and like not have, like not risk kind of putting like imposing harm onto your fellow visitors by them seeing it too. And there was kind of a, like, what do they call it? Like the Streisand effect, like where when you like when you go so far out of your way to like cancel something that it's all people want to see. I felt like there was a way
I didn't
that,
know there was a name for that, the Streisand
oh
effect.
yeah,
That's
oh,
I'm
there's a
going to
name for
use that
everything.
more.
God bless the internet. But it I remember walking through that show and being like, let people have their own experience, even if it's negative. Like, even if there is something traumatizing to it, which I don't, I think traumatizing is that word doesn't mean what I think people think it means, but like, it's just so overused.
It's so overused. And it's actually pretty offensive for people who have actually gone through physical violence or sexual
Yeah.
violence and things that are
Yeah.
actually traumatic. I mean, I'm going to just go out on a limb and say that. I know I'm probably going to offend some people by saying that, but it's just, I honestly
No,
think it's very offensive how overused it's been.
I agree. I agree. And I saw this show in 2021 or 2022. And it was in the same gallery that in 2017 there had been a show, before, like in the before times. There had been a show of Henrik Ross's photographs from the Lodz Ghetto. And I led tours in that gallery. I did a podcast episode in that gallery. That show was tremendous. It was incredible. But there were some very graphic photos in that show of dead children, like close-ups of dead children, in order to make the point of what he had access to and what he photographed. It was this combination of, he was like one of the handful of people, maybe the only one. He was assigned to take kind of passport photos, or like ID photos, not passports, but like ID photos in the ghetto. And so he was issued a camera, and he did this kind of you see the ID photos that he took, you see the propaganda photos that he was forced to take of Jews in the ghetto, kind of like happily, kind of like whistling while they worked, basically, so that could then be shown to the world, like, look how well we're treated. It's like, look how happy people are to be part of our kind of manufacturing process. And then he would also take really clandestine photos of like the hell that actually was. This show was incredible. There were no black screens that says it was wrong then and it's wrong now. I mean, they trusted visitors to move through it. And I remember I got to the really painful photos, and I was very affected by them. And I knew that there was like a part of the gallery that like I couldn't look at. I couldn't, and I had to be in there a lot. And it was like, I just drew this line where it was like, don't go near there, for kind of your own mental health. But I did that. That was my own coping mechanism. That was my own resilience to still go in. That was me recognizing my own boundaries, that I couldn't look at those photos again. And the museum trusted me to know my own limits. And I think that putting them behind a black shutter, putting a sign that says, like, you can call this trauma-informed counselor if you really can't handle it, not only is incredibly disruptive to the exhibition, but it's patronizing. Like,
I was about to say, it sounds like they're treating visitors like they're small children.
yeah.
And children sometimes even will go through some pretty difficult stuff. And, we try our best to protect them from those things, but it's kind of a part of life, and then they grow, and we trust that process to a certain extent. I mean, there's debates about how parenting has also changed over the past couple of decades, but it's all just
That's my other job.
That's that's your other job. But I am very struck by that, by the way you describe this exhibition about the KKK. I'm just like, don't we trust that mostly grown adults walking into these exhibitions are gonna be able to manage if they have a negative emotion? It seems to me, from what you're saying, Tamar, is like, I kind of think about, like, are we so uncomfortable with having these very strong reactions and emotions just going about our world? Like, we're going to encounter things that really upset us, that make us so sad, and that make us cry and make us angry and make us really happy. Like, I don't think we should be sheltered from those things. Like, living here in Los Angeles, for instance, we just went through these awful wildfires, and there are people who are, I was okay. There are people who are still dealing with the effects of this. And it's like, I don't, as hard as this has been to see other people suffer like this, I can just say for myself, I don't want to be protected from how terrible the news has been, or images of people's homes burned down, or entire neighborhoods just completely wiped out. This has changed the course of LA history. Absolutely.
Right.
And to try to maybe put a black shutter on that, as you were saying, would almost, I don't know how to put this, it would sterilize and silence a whole aspect of Angelino's lives that is frankly very unfair to the people experiencing it. And I'll just say that right there. Maybe people would disagree with me, but I do think what you're saying is really important, particularly when it comes to this whole issue of art and censorship.
Yeah. Well, and resilience is a muscle. It doesn't, you don't just come out of the womb with this muscle fully formed, but we do have an incredible ability to grow it and to exercise it. And I think that looking for opportunities for people to be spared from knowing their own resilience, their own boundaries, is just a real disservice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tamar, what do you hope for in terms of where artists can play a role in society, and what kind of role museums should be playing in society? Is there anything that you really hope for?
Bravery. I hope that artists can kind of get back to offending people again.
You've got one job.
Productively offending people, like there are incredibly puerile ways of offending people, and that art is not going to last. But there's a way to encourage a subversion of the way you think the world should look that says, but what if it looked completely opposite? And you can say, ugh, I hate that. But I never would have thought about it that way. And people can make their own decisions. Maybe this is what I meant by talking about journalists with emotions. Like, I see the role of a journalist to kind of present the facts and ask the audience, ask the reader to come to their own conclusions. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Like, human nature depends on groupthink, and where you sit in your own tribe. That's a very, very hard thing to break out of. It takes active participation, and I don't think democracy and liberal values are the way that our brains are naturally wired. I think it's something that you have to work for every day. when people talk about the importance of diversity, I think that diverse perspectives are a huge part of that. And I can't understand, like, it doesn't make sense to me that that's gotten lost in this like buzzword diversity climate. So I just want museums, going back to how we started, if it's a museum's job to be the steward of the art that comes out of a cultural moment, it has to be all of it, all the good art. And if an artist is going to be brave enough to recognize that there are some really complicated problems going on right now and some really complicated conversations, and be encouraged to just kind of like subvert somebody's thinking, it's the responsibility of the museum, if it's good, to show it to people. And I just think that I can't imagine any other way forward than that.
Yeah. Yeah. Tamar, this was such a fantastic conversation with so much depth and so much honesty. And you're willing to go.
And we're both canceled.
And we're both canceled. Oh my God. Yeah. No, but I really do think it's so important to be able to go to these places in a way that is respectful and you're listening. And that's the thing. That's why this is so different than, say, watching like a Talking Heads segments. Cause like people are actually listening to each other. And I hope that that's what listeners can get from listening to your episode and listening to this podcast. So thank you very much for being on the Cheeky Scholar. It's just such a pleasure having you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for encouraging a conversation of this magnitude of honesty. It's definitely not a conversation I could have had 5 years ago. So I'm grateful for, even with everything that's gone on in the last 5 years and in the last 5 months and in the last 5 minutes. I don't know. I haven't, my phone's been on Do Not Disturb for this whole hour. So who knows how, what else is,
who knows if there's been another regime change,
Yeah, exactly. But I appreciate that, I can talk to somebody like you. And the truth is, most people, when they have a one-on-one opportunity to talk to each other, there's a lot more sanity individually in these conversations than there are in big group, opinions that you're supposed to have and on social media. Yeah. And it's like, it's very reassuring to know that like, maybe we can take what's been oversimplified in this time and like return the complexity to it.
Wonder what professors yak about after a couple of beers? Point that monkey digit at your phone and hit the subscribe button. You'll get the newest episodes delivered right to your favorite podcast app. Thanks for joining us on the Cheeky Scholar. And until next time, keep it real and keep it cheeky.